about fashion. Even though you clearly embodied the style sense of the young Helen Keller. Remember that? I think this actually tracked, if I recall correctly, with the complaints of your first roommate. She was fascinated by the fact that you would traipse around the apartment wearing nothing but your panties, with the curtains wide open. Then you'd express shock that what you were doing was any big deal. And do you recall why you couldn't understand the furore, Cathy? It was because you believed you were fully clothed. That's when the schizophrenia began to take. I mean, I knew you were a little weird even back then, but I dug you anyway. For one thing, you had this way of being incredibly nasty and arrogant, and yet, at the same time, dismissive of everyone and everything. As a guy who seems drawn to women with a penchant for removing my balls and stuffing them in their purse for safekeeping, I was entranced. Plus, you were as bitchy and cynical in print as I was, more even. And you were an even funnier and more clever writer than I was, which really pissed me off. Really pissed me off, it did. In fact, most people here today don't know this, but I actually plotted your murder for that very reason. But in all 5 instances, the hitmen I'd hired came away empty and complaining that they'd been belittled for their efforts in one of your columns. So I gave up. But I made sure to remain friends with you, biding my time, waiting for my opening. Yet at some point it became pointless. I grew to be just another fawning member of the Cathy Seipp as a Godless Goddess Appreciation Society. But I also became increasingly concerned over time because things just weren't adding up. And I knew it wasn't because I can't add, it was because you were insane. May I cite a few examples? Thank you. You stepped over to the dark side and became a Republican, mostly because you thought the free food would improve. Democrats eat corn dogs, Republicans eat their young, which I've always heard is far tastier. But then you'd also take to ranting like a lunatic. Bill Clinton is evil! George W. Bush is the brightest man in the whole wide world! Karl Rove is a sweet, sweet man! Tax cuts for the wealthy will help all of us in freelance journalism! Don't you get it? Education is unnecessary, it's a tool of the left! Anyone who gets an abortion should be executed by firing squad! And did I mention that George Bush is the man who will save this country from the terrorists? They're all hiding out in Iraq! Do you hear me? All of them! Once we capture Hussein, they'll all surrender! I know, because my friend Amy Elcon, the advice goddess, told me! And on she went. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. I remember the day that Cathy told me she'd met this really, really cool guy from Australia, who is now her very best friend in the whole wide world. She'd say, he used to be an icon of the online porn industry, but now he's an Orthodox Jew. And I'm like, oh. I sort of treated her like I would a small child telling me a tale about the Easter Bunny, you know. And what would this gentleman's name be? Luke Ford, she announced. And I thought, couldn't you have come up with a better concocted handle than that? I mean, shit, it's only a couple consonants off from John Doe. I'd go with Cathy to the TV Critics Association press tour events, and she'd take me aside, this look of horror in her eyes, and whisper, you've got to help me, I'm being stalked by this overweight Christian woman from someplace in the South. She wants to talk to me all the time. And Cathy, I know why you call your blog Cathy's World. It's because you really believe the entire world is actually yours. I saw that letter you wrote to the government asking for a formal name change from the United States of America to Seipp's Place. I thought it was a little scary, but I dismissed it as stress-related. It was about the same time I noticed Cathy's daughter Maya had changed her name to Cecile Dubois and began negotiations to enter the federal daughter protection program to distance herself from her mother. And now we're up to 2001. Cathy, remember this? You suddenly began to sprinkle references to your identical cousin Patty in your conversation. You remember that? She's a lot more wild than I am, a lot more, you'd say. Patty loves to rock and roll. A hot dog makes her lose control. Do you remember that? It actually makes her incontinent. And I thought, you know, you'd say, I've lived everywhere from Zanzibar to Berkeley Square. It's like we're a pair of matching bookends. And I'm like, okay. I decided to do a little research, and of course, you have no identical cousin named Patty. You were suddenly under the delusion you were part of the Patty Duke show, and I tried to point this out, but you were adamant. I do have an identical cousin. So I decided it would do no good to belabor the point, and I let it go. But Then we come to the biggest piece of evidence of all, and Cathy, I think you know what I'm about to say. Don't worry, this is for your own good. You're among friends. But we'd be remiss if we didn't let the cat out of the bag. We know your secret. We know that you are Nikki Fink. We know that you felt the need to manufacture her in your mind out of sheer loneliness. Out of the need to have a muse, an adversary, an alter ego, a larger-than-life nut job based on a whale-like Star Wars character. It's all right. It's okay. We know you did it just to keep your name out there. Hey, we get it. Any of us would have done the same thing, I'm sure, if we were similarly batshit crazy, but it's time to let go. We understand all too well that Nikki Fink represents the self-loathing we all feel from time to time. I mean, actually threatening litigation against what it turns out is yourself is a little over the top. But we get that it's in keeping with this whole MO of self-delusion that the Thorazine is bound to help remedy. Trust me. But Cathy, to send yourself a telegram from Nikki Fink at your own roast? Oh, I mean, it's like a twisted subplot in a David Lynch nightmare. Do you mind if I read it? Okay. It's short. It's short, as you know.
We only have room till 9.
No? Rob, long.